Jeff, let's talk a little bit about the historical Jesus and the sort of impact that study of the historical Jesus makes on us. I think one of the reasons I'd like to talk to you about this is that you have great passion on the question. You love to study history of theology, for one thing, and I know you're really taking seriously the opportunity to study Jesus, the historical personage, and because it puts us in touch with the one we're trying to identify with, I think, and who we claim as model for our lives. So I don't know if you want to respond to that personally or not, but
well, model in a good sense, not in the sense of somebody to mimic, but rather Jesus, first century person. This is how he responds to God, and the question is then, how do I, in the 20th century, hear that same call as mediated to me through Jesus? But then, what does my response look like? And it's not going to be the same as Jesus's, but certainly gives me some direction.
And gives us inspiration as well.
Exactly.
Yes, indeed. Well, we have some important new books on this whole question of the historical Jesus, which prompts our discussion. John Meyer, a Catholic scholar, teaches where? I think at Catholic University.
The Catholic University of America.
Yes. The book was actually out in 1991. It's called A Marginal Jew, Rethinking the Historical Jesus. And I find that category, marginal Jew, to be helpful. It's a reminder that Jesus is totally rooted in a Jewish culture, lived as a Jew, had Jewish parents, and celebrated Jewish feasts, and lived his whole life within that Jewish context. That's important to remember. But the word margin is also helpful to us. It suggests that in many ways Jesus really was not part of the mainstream. He wasn't in the proper groupings of his time. He didn't fit. He's a unique kind of prophetic character. So he's marginal in terms of the whole world history and his own national history. He's insignificant. One line in Tacitus, the Roman historian. No, he's on the margins in terms of his not having a job, of quitting his job and roaming around as a preacher. No, he's on the margins in terms of his teachings and his style of teaching. He's on the margin because he's a poor layman, so he's in opposition somehow to the entrenched classes in Jerusalem. So in many ways, he's just a marginalized person. And I want to take up one more of those and to talk about the fact that he's on the margin because he's considered a criminal. He's finally executed by the Roman authorities, the occupying power, as a threat somehow to their status as the occupying power of this country. So we want to talk about Jesus on the margins in terms of his own death and resurrection. But before we do that, I want to go back to some of these criteria and ask you to comment on them a little bit, because there's ways in which we say that we can know more about Jesus if we keep in mind certain factors. For one is what we call the criterion of embarrassment. That is, if Jesus it says something about Jesus that makes him look bad, then it probably happened, like being executed by the Roman authorities. I mean, and that's even looked down upon within Judaism. In the book of Deuteronomy, he was hung on a tree. I mean, this is a terrible kind of thing. So that criterion of embarrassment. I don't know if you wanted to comment on any of the other ones or not. The criterion of discontinuity. That is, does he fit in with his times, of multiple attestations, whether we find it in all the Gospels and all the sources of the Gospels and so on. And then, does it cohere? Does it hold together? Does it make sense? What it said, what we think about the historical Jesus. And then finally, this fifth criterion I want to raise up here, the rejection and the execution. I could put it in simple terms that a bland Jesus would not have been taken to the cross. Somebody walking around saying, let's look at the lilies of the field and let's all be nice to one another, would hardly be a threat either to the religious authorities or to the Roman authorities. So somehow we got to account for the fact that they needed to crucify him.
This is a different sort of criterion from the others. The others dealt directly with the sayings. What this criterion does is to point us toward the fact of Jesus' death, the fact of his execution at the hand of the Roman authorities, and then it leads us back to the sayings. Which sayings of Jesus might account for the fact that he was in this kind of trouble, that they would go to these sorts of ends to eliminate him. And so if we can find sayings that would help us to explain or to throw light on this fact, that's the criterion that we're using here.
And also actions, right?
Yes.
Sayings and actions. They must have done some things that were provocative to cause this. If we look at in terms of action, the one that comes to mind immediately would be the cleansing of the temple. That is to come into the capital city of Jerusalem and to attack somehow the authority structure. I think that is one of the interplays that we get going on between Jesus and the religious authorities. In other words, why were they upset by him? Well, one thing is this provocative act of going into the temple. The temple represented the priestly class, their authority, the control of the temple area. And Jesus, by this provocative act, undercuts that kind of authority.
We talked earlier in a previous program about Jesus marginalizing himself and making himself obnoxious, I think is the word that Meyer uses. And precisely in the cleansing of the temple, he is terribly obnoxious to these temple authorities. This is the way that this operates. We've got this all set up. It works fine. And Jesus comes in and through a physical, I think in the Old Testament we might call this symbolic prophecy. By doing this thing, he's making a very strong statement that God, as Jesus envisions God, is not pleased with this sort of business.
Right, and so we get some antipathy created here with the ruling religious establishment, the priestly class, the Sadducees in Jerusalem, who very often were sort of collaborating with the Roman occupying power because it gave them a privileged position, or they were a little bit better off, even though they were under their thumb. We see that I guess, throughout history when a greater power occupies a lesser one, that some will cooperate because they get certain perks out of it. So we have the Sadducees doing that, and now Jesus is sort of undercutting that kind of position. It would make them nervous. I mean, he might cause trouble here, and the Romans might not like it. Pilate might not like it, and therefore we have to be careful about all of this.
It's difficult to gauge how much of a problem Jesus was to them. If he's a massive threat, or if he's simply like a bug that's flying around your head all the time, and it's not a major threat to your health and well-being, but after a while you get the fly swatter and you nail it simply because this is a problem that I just don't have to deal with or don't want to deal with from day to day.
Yes, it is, and a lot depends on whether you think Jesus came to Jerusalem just once, cleansed the temple and did that, and then came there when they apprehended him, or whether he came more often and tried to address the crowds at the times of the big feast. And I think scholars generally, John Meyer, we've been using his book here, A Marginal Jew, Rethinking the Historical Jesus, that book really thinks that Jesus did rather, not frequently, but on the big feast did go to Jerusalem and cause a stir by his preaching, and especially this idea that you could contact God directly, that in the kingdom God was accessible, and that we needed to undercut the usual social distinctions, or that's what would happen if we treated each other as equals, and that this would be somehow provocative to them as well.
One of the points that John Crossan makes in his book is that Jesus brings his message to the people. He goes to where they are and he uses images that they know and ideas that they have and appeals to their everyday experience. And that's a very different marketing technique than the people in the temple would use. We've got the temple, we've got the stuff, you have to come here, you have to use our money, you have to use our ideas. Jesus' approach is absolutely at odds with the way that they understand how God relates to people.
Now let's look at, you mentioned John Dominic Crossan's book, The Historical Jesus, The Life of a Mediterranean Jewish Peasant, which is also a wonderful source for uncovering what we know about Jesus. And he puts this whole thing in the context of the Jewish life under an occupying power. Rome is the great power, the emperor is in control, and they set up these puppet kings like Herod the Great, but then in Judea they also have their direct governor. That's why we have Pontius Pilate, who governed there from the procurator from 26 to 36. And what Crossan points out is how all through the period of Jesus' life and beyond, all the way up to the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, there is sort of a type of unrest that's going on. Everyone's trying to figure out, how do you relate to this Roman power? And he points out that periodically there were these people who challenged the Roman power. For example, in the time of Pilate, there was a nonviolent revolution. What the Jews didn't seem to like is when they wanted to put standards of the emperor, images of the emperor, into the temple or introduce them into Jerusalem. There was a rebellion. And he speaks about the nonviolent rebellion when masses of Jewish men came out and brought their women and children with them and were going against the Roman power in what we would today call sort of a sit-in, a nonviolent sit-in. And that was one of the methods that was used. And at times the Romans backed down. At times the Romans said, we are not going to slaughter all these people. And they said, well, we will take the images out, or we won't introduce this statue of the emperor, which is so offensive to these people. I think it's important to remember that the Romans were really not in the business of persecuting religions. They were more in the business of letting them, the occupying countries, have their own religious traditions as long as they didn't somehow lead them into a rebellious posture.
That was part of the genius of the Roman Empire, to find those local customs and local religions that worked along with their project and allow them to function independently as much as they could. And of course, in introducing these standards, they're claiming some hegemony over this local religious thing. And of course, with the Jews, you're bringing graven images into the temple. That's certainly not accepted at all. So that they're pushing, they're struggling to take something over, but at the same time they're allowing something to go on, and that helped them to form this broad coalition over the Mediterranean world.
Indeed. So that what the picture that we get from Crossan, therefore, is of efforts upon the Jewish people to somehow define themselves in this position of being occupied. And it created sort of an ongoing tension where the peasants are finally driven by the year 66, when the Great War broke out between the Jews and the Romans, to fight, because the taxation got greater and greater, and their ability to just survive on the margins became less and less. They were moving to becoming destitute, and it became almost necessary to move into this armed revolt. That brings up the whole story of the Zealots. And again, Crossan locates the Zealots as being those peasants who decided somewhere along the line during the time of Jesus and before and after to take up arms against the Romans. That was the way that one would have to do it. He also points out, just to give a flavor for this whole first century, that one of the reasons that Jerusalem ended up being destroyed in the War of 66 to 70 is that within Judaism itself, that the peasant class took over from the urban intellectuals, the academics and the priests, and became the dominant power within Jerusalem itself, so that there was really no way now to negotiate with the Romans. These peasants were not of a mind or of a background or of a temperament to really do that kind of negotiating as maybe the Sadducees would have been able to do. And they took a very strong stand and got into this militaristic posture and ended up finally being destroyed in this long war, 66 to 70, which culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem. Crossan brings up all of that to help us to understand the general climate. Why was it that Pilate needed to rub out Jesus? And the answer comes because they were in danger always of this revolt, this overthrow. The people, you had to be very careful as the occupying power. And that this sort of set up a mindset that, well, you got to be careful of these claimants to be messiahs, because there were other messiahs at the time. In fact, Crossan in one place says that throughout this first century there was something like 2,000 supposed messiahs who were crucified.
I'd never heard a number that high. That's amazing to me.
Crossan says that and he's quoting somebody else, I think, that crucifixion of people who were potential insurrectionists and so on would have reached as many as 2,000. I think he's going to that whole century of time up till the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. So we're not dealing with sort of an odd fact here in a way. That's what Rome did, and crucifixion, of course, was used as a particularly cruel form of punishment because it would make a sign to others. People, that's why they crucified him, where there would be passersby, so that the Roman would show that if you're going to act like this, this is what's going to happen to you. It was a way of putting down rebellions. I think the other thing that Crossan shows is that as the first century wore on, the nonviolence that was in place earlier on, and this very successful ways that they used with Pilate, became gradually more violent. As Rome became more repressive, it moved the revolutionaries to take up arms.
What you're saying is that this is a tinder keg. Is that the word
Yeah.
they use? It's about to go up, and Jesus is another one of these people in this long line of possible threats to this delicate balance.
Right. I think that's the picture that Crossan gives of what happens here. And of course, I mean, we have to look at this. I mean, our premise was that, how do you know what's really historical about Jesus? The premise is he must have acted and did things that were provocative to produce his death, his execution. Now, we can take the story along this line, I think, and say that what happened is he ran afoul of the religious leaders because he hurt their authority, and they felt a need to get rid of him. And that within that milieu, then, they end up handing him over to the Romans. That's the story as we hear it in broad base. It might be well, Jeff, to go through a little bit of that history of the story of the last days of Jesus, because they're quite different in the Synoptics and in John. And the difference occurs in whether the Last Supper of Jesus is a Passover meal or not. That becomes very crucial. Did it happen on Passover Day that Jesus celebrated this, or, as in John's Gospel, is it before Passover? And I don't know if you wanted to comment on that at all.
Well, there's a theological point to be made there. If Jesus dies on the day that the Paschal Lamb is sacrificed, then Jesus takes on the significance of the Paschal Lamb, that he dies as sacrifice. And there's argument among biblical scholars, among liturgists, in terms of the origins of the Eucharist, over when exactly this happened, and it's difficult to date. It's very difficult to date.
You know, John Meyer argues in this way. He accepts John's chronology. He thinks that Jesus did not celebrate a Passover meal at the Last Supper, but indeed was the day of preparation. And he argues this way. He says, if you look at the Synoptics, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called Synoptics because they look the same. You put them in columns. They're very similar. John's Gospel is quite different in chronology and outlook and so on. But the Synoptic chronology, this is the way Meyer sort of summarized it. It demands that within the night and early day hours of Passover itself, the 15th of Nisan, they're the month of Nisan in the Jewish calendar, the supreme Jewish authorities would arrest a person, Jesus, suspected of a capital crime, convene a meeting of the Sanhedrin, that's their major body, hold a meeting, hold a formal trial with witnesses, reach the decision that the criminal deserved to die, figure out that they couldn't do that themselves, then hand him over to the Gentile authorities, to Pilate, with a request for his execution. They would all do that in a very short framework. It's always been hard to figure out how all that got done in the Synoptic version. On the other hand, he thinks that if you adopt John's chronology, you've got this over a couple-day period, and it's easier to see how it all would have worked out. So he thinks that Jesus' Last Supper was not a Passover meal.
Some liturgists talk about this, and they point out that we call it the Last Supper. It's not the only supper. It's the last of a series of meals, and that people in Jesus' time and place in these various small Jewish sects would gather for what they call a chavorah meal, a fellowship meal, and that this was a regular feature of Jesus' gathering with his disciples. And so, while in retrospect, theologically, we'd like to see it be a Passover meal because it connects some things for us, there's a sense where this is the regular gathering of these people, and it's at that point that Jesus says, keep on doing this even after I'm gone.
Mm-hmm. It becomes one way of understanding our Eucharist, doesn't it, as a fellowship meal, as our way of gathering, remembering Jesus, telling the stories again, coming together to celebrate, to worship God, and to produce, to help facilitate this communal bonding that we're supposed to have as Christians. I think the Last Supper story can be read in many ways. But as we know, in John's account, which we interestingly read on Holy Thursday, is of the washing of the feet.
Mm-hmm.
a statement of service in connection with the farewell meal. John gives a lot of space to the farewell meal. It's not that he doesn't have it. It's not he has a farewell discourse and so on, and the washing of the feet, but it's not put into the framework of being a Passover meal.
One scholar that I've read likes to make the point that Paul and the Synoptics tell us what Jesus and the disciples did at that Last Supper. John tells us what that Last Supper means.
Right. That the Eucharist ought to move us to a life of charity and to a life of service.
Exactly, a Eucharistic lifestyle, pouring oneself out.
There's a couple other incidents that maybe we could get into that, again, John Meyer in his book, A Marginal Jew, argues that the Barabbas incident also makes us think that John's chronology is right. That, and it says it this way, that there suggests the releasing of a prisoner so he could go and celebrate the Passover meal. That's why you would be releasing someone, because that's the big... you wouldn't think of doing it after Passover. It'd be like releasing someone after Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
No, the idea would be to release them the day before Christmas so that they could go home and celebrate the big event, the biggest event of the year, the Passover meal. And so that's another reason why he thinks that the Barabbas incident reinforces John's chronology. The other one is the idea of going to a wealthy patron's house. If it was indeed Passover when they celebrated it, you'd ask, well, weren't they having a Passover meal in this rich man's house? Why wasn't his whole family there? Why was it there was a room that was empty for Jesus and his disciples? The day before Passover, that would make sense. So these are all arguments, and it gives people an idea of how scholars try to figure out what really has happened here.
What's interesting, of course, is that usually when people think about the historical Jesus, they look to the synoptics right away, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're earlier. And John is so filled with theology that they don't look there for history or chronology. And Meyer's argument, which I find very impressive, seems to argue for real history within John, that we can rely on it for historical data.
It's interesting, even though it's written much later, we think in the middle 90s, it means that something that's written later can still be more historically accurate than something written closer to the event.
Exactly.
An interesting idea. You mentioned the idea of theology, and there is a lot of that in there that we should look at. One of the important things is the idea that Jesus died freely. You got the whole tradition that Jesus goes to Jerusalem, but that he's got a sense that he could run into trouble there. Mm-hmm. He goes there knowing that the religious authorities are not happy with him. They didn't like him last time he was there. And he could get in trouble again, and he could be condemned by the Sanhedrin. He knew that the Romans were worried about these messiahs and that they crucified them. And so he had a premonition and a good, well-based judgment that this could be his end. And yet he goes there freely and is ready to accept what happens, despite the fact that he hasn't gotten the kingdom established yet. He's still working on his big mission in life to make sure the cause of God is established in the world. It's not done yet he goes to Jerusalem and ready to face the consequences.
Well, and I like very much the way you phrased that. I think many of us in our religious education, Jesus was born to die. And Jesus dies then, and somehow his death satisfies God, and our sins are forgiven. I think if we look at the historical Jesus, Jesus comes to announce the reign of God and to struggle to establish that, and he grows into a sense of his mission, that it's his job to announce God's word. And he knows, going to Jerusalem, that he places himself in jeopardy. But he knows, I think, too, and you see this in some representations of the trial with Pilate, it seems that if Jesus promises to shut up and get out of town, everything will be okay. They're going to leave him alone. Of course, the project for the kingdom dies. What's impressive about Jesus in the New Testament, as I read these stories, is his fidelity to his mission. And there's a sense where I think we can say Jesus dies out of his fidelity to the mission. And because of that fidelity, God raises him up. And salvation becomes a possibility. But it's not a question of, I have to go die to wash everybody's sins away. Rather, I have to announce the word. Well, why don't you shut up and you can save your life? No, I've got to do this. Well, they'll kill you. Yes, I know.
That's well said, Jeff. And I think it really changes the feeling about the death of Jesus, the historical figure. That it's really out of conviction and principle and fidelity to the cause. That's what brings him to his death. Not because he's a masochist who's seeking somehow to suffer to make up for our sins. And I think that makes him a much more attractive figure. And there's a great obvious payoff for ourselves. I mean, in fidelity to our missions, in fidelity to our responsibilities, our family responsibilities, our tasks in life.
Like, you see things in our own century, people like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, people who have maintained fidelity to their mission, and they die as a consequence of that. We see some connection between Jesus' witness and their witness. There's something there. If we do the history well and go back and say, now what exactly happened and why did it happen, things become much more intelligible. And God, frankly, now is seen as reaching out to us to announce the reign of God, not demanding the death of Jesus as some ugly payoff. It's the only thing that will make me happy to take care of your original sin. Rather, Jesus' death is the result of God reaching out to us. Not something demanded by God, but something that humankind does in response to God's generous gesture. And again, God's fidelity to us, that in spite of knowing that this is the outcome of this, God says, I will do this anyway.
That is so important pastorally, it seems to me, and for the spiritual life, Jeff, that we have that more positive image of God who's with us, and not an angry God who's demanding death to make up for sins. That's, I think, a really poor and finally destructive way to think about God. Well, we have could say so much more about this, about the death of Jesus and the history of it, but I like the slant you've put on it here at the end, and you're so good at that in finding the pastoral applications, and that is that if we see Jesus' death in the light of these historical facts, he appears more real to us. He appears as a man committed to living out the cause of God, and then we're able to see resurrection as God's affirmation and vindication of this whole life of the historical Jesus.